Mr. President, I'd like to use some of my time on a couple of these amendments. I know this must be difficult for the chair to figure out which time to apply to which amendments, but I'll try to identify it. First, with regard to what's known as Feingold web tester number 3979, which the senator from Missouri was just addressing. He referred to our concerns that somehow the rights and privacy of Americans could be affected by this bill as tired accusations. I object to that characterization. I think this is clearly the kind of thing we should be worried about in debating. But I'll tell you what is a tired accusation. The notion that somehow our amendments would affect the ability of the government to listen in on Osama bin Laden. That is a tired and false accusation. The senator from Missouri said, as if Osama bin Laden or his number 3 man, whoever that is today, after the last number 3 man in al-Qaeda was just wiped out, calls somebody in the United States, we can't listen into that communication unless we have an independent means of verifying that it has some impact on threats to our security from a terrorist threat. That's what he claims. That's what he claims. We wouldn't be able to listen in on that kind of conversation. That is absolutely false. This amendment, the Feingold web tester amendment, specifically does not require a FISA court warrant to acquire or disseminate the communications of any foreigner overseas who is suspected of terrorism. And, Mr. President, there is no separate threat requirement. The amendment merely requires that the government label terrorism-related communications that have one end in the United States so that they are traceable for subsequent oversight. And it simply requires that when the government accesses and disseminates terrorism-related communications that is already acquired, it already has acquired it, that the court just be informed with a brief certification. So I don't know where the senator gets this idea, really bizarre idea, that somehow you can't listen in on a conversation of Osama bin Laden. And I don't think it's credible to anybody that that would be the case. And finally, he raises the concern that somehow we're insulting the FISA court, saying they're not doing a good job. No, what we're trying to give them is the power to enforce their will. We're trying to give them the ability to say, hey, wait a minute, you guys aren't doing what you said you were going to do, that's all. That's not an insult to the court. That's essential for the court to be able to do its job. Let's worry less about the alleged and, frankly, false notions about the feelings of a secret court and worry more about the rights and privacy of perfectly innocent Americans. Now, Mr. President, turning to Amendment 3915, another amendment I've offered known as the Use Limits Amendment. As I explained yesterday, my amendment simply gives the FISA court the option of limiting the government's use of information about U.S. persons that is collected under procedures the FISA court later determines to be illegal. Mr. President, that's about as minimal a safeguard as you can get. And it's unfortunate that some of those who oppose my amendment are mischaracterizing what it does. The Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence sent the Majority Leader a letter today in which they expressed their objections to this amendment. Twice in their letter, they stated that this amendment would place use limits on information that does not concern U.S. persons. Now, that is flat out false, Mr. President. The use limits proposed in this amendment specifically apply to, and I quote, information concerning any United States person, unquote. That's what it says. The use limits in this amendment are only under those circumstances. There's nothing ambiguous about this language. These are patently false claims that the amendment applies to information about non-U.S. persons, and it just shows the lengths to which the opponents of this bill will go to generate opposition to this or any other reasonable amendment. We've also heard that the amendment would create a massive operational burden. But, Mr. President, that also just isn't true. The government already does what is necessary to implement the use limits in the amendment. First, declassified government responses to oversight questions of the Congressional Intelligence Committees reveal that the government is already labeling communications obtained under the so-called Protect America Act. So the government already tracks which communications are acquired under these particular authorities, which would be the first step here. Second, the government already has to comply with minimization requirements that are supposed to protect information about U.S. persons. Now, these requirements kick in whenever the government wants to disseminate any acquired communications that include information about U.S. persons. That means intelligence analysts already have to determine before any communications collected under these authorities can be used in any of the contexts we're talking about here, whether they contain any information about U.S. persons. Indeed, the administration constantly reminds us of this fact when claiming that these minimization procedures and requirements do enough to protect Americans. So, Mr. President, given that the government is already required and equipped to examine any communications it proposes to use in order to determine whether U.S. person information is present, the argument that this amendment somehow imposes a massive new burden is very difficult to understand. Perhaps the explanation lies in the administration's repeated statements that the amendment would put limits on the use of information about non-U.S. persons. If these statements were true, then it is conceivable that my amendment would create an additional operational burden. But those statements are also completely and utterly false, as I've explained. The amendment explicitly states that the use limits apply to, quote, information concerning any United States person, unquote, information that is already subject to minimization requirements. I also want to address the argument that the chair of the Intelligence Committee made that this amendment is somehow different than the existing use limits for emergency surveillance. The chair argued that the amendment, unlike the emergency use limits, could affect thousands of communications. Now, as I pointed out yesterday, the amendment addresses that concern by creating a huge exception to the use limitations, an exception that is not present in the so-called emergency use limits provision. Under the amendment, the FISA court can allow the government to use even information about U.S. persons that is obtained by unlawful procedures as long as the government fixes the problem with the procedures. So, in fact, this amendment is far less restrictive than the use limits for emergency surveillance, despite the claim of the chairman otherwise. But even more important, we have to remember what these thousands of communications are. The only information that would be subject to use limits is information about U.S. persons collected under illegal procedures, procedures that failed to reasonably target people overseas. The underlying bill prohibits the government from collecting this information in the first place, as was just pointed out in some of the arguments made by my opponents on this. My amendment gives that prohibition some teeth by limiting the use of information that has been illegally collected. So the argument goes that they have no intention of getting at anything that would be unreasonable under the law. We say, okay, if they do it, there ought to be some enforcement. There ought to be some way to make sure that doesn't happen, not just the assurance of the chairman and the vice chairman. And if the government has collected thousands of communications illegally, isn't that all the more reason to try to contain the damage and limit the impact on innocent Americans? Now, that's not hamstringing the government. It's just requiring the government to comply with the law that we're actually passing. My amendment simply provides an incentive for the administration to follow the law as it is written. We pass a law that has no meaningful consequence for noncompliance with the law. I think we're taking a real gamble as to whether the administration will choose to comply. And I'm not personally willing to accept odds on that one. Once again, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time. I yield.